Welcome to the Research Culture Uncovered podcast, where in every episode we explore what is research culture and what should it be. You'll hear thoughts and opinions from a range of contributors to help you change research culture into what you want it to be.
Okay, so I'm Tony Bromley and welcome to the Research Culture Uncovered podcast. This is season 2, and in season 2 we are speaking to people who presented at the Research Education and Development Scholarship Conference of 2022. The conference theme was "How do we stop losing talent in research careers?" And in terms of research culture, through that title it covered an awful lot of aspects from research culture. Today, I'm delighted we've got with me Cecile Menard from the Institute for Academic Development at the University of Edinburgh. And the title of the presentation was "Researchers in Long-Term Employment on Temporary Contracts, the Sisyphus of Academia." So hello to you.
Hello, Tony.
Are you okay today?
Yes, very well. Thank you very much.
I know we sort of ask about doing an icebreaker just to, make it more personal so people learn a little bit about us. And just in when we were talking earlier, you mentioned that you were a pub landlady, which is a different one for me. So what was that all about?
Yes, indeed. Well, I worked in the service industry for about 10 years after I went to school, got my baccalaureate in France in 93. And I was actually a mature student in England, and started my undergraduate degree when I was 28. So there's a 10-year gap during which I was a waitress, I was a barmaid, and when I moved to the UK, I was a waitress for about 3 years, moved to Brighton, worked in a pub, and as things go, the then pub landlady left, and I was offered the job, and initially I said no. So I went back to the boss, the owner of the pub, and said no, okay, I'll take the job. So there you go. That was in Brighton between 2000 and 2002. The Barley Mow, for people who know that pub.
Oh, well, we may well have people who know the Brighton area or on the call. Now, it's interesting people's backgrounds, and there's in terms of the conference, there was one or two presentations about mature people coming into PhD programs mature, because we still, to a lot of extent follow cliches of people being 21 straight out of degree programs and go to PhDs, and it never was entirely the case, but it's increasingly not the case. So it's interesting to hear your background. I was going to get to your title, actually. So in your title, Researchers in Long-Term Employment on Temporary Contracts, the Sisyphus of Academia. So I've got to come clean, and I'm not an expert in the Greek mythology. So I just wondered if you could perhaps explain the metaphor why you chose Sisyphus and what Sisyphus did, or what happened to Sisyphus.
What happened to Sisyphus? Well, if you want, I can start first saying who I'm talking about, which maybe would make more sense. So when I say researchers in long-term employment on short-term contract, that's a bit of a mouthful. So I will shorten that to long-term researchers. And what we've defined as long-term researchers are people who have been in short-term employment for more than 8 years. And usually the 8 years is quite important, because a lot of funding bodies have narrowed their eligibility criteria to be able to apply, for example, for independent research fellowships to about 8 years. And although some of those eligibility criteria are being lifted now, you still have to justify, after a number of years after your PhD, why you're still, for example, applying for early career independent fellowships. So you still have to justify why maybe you don't have the publication numbers or the amount of funding. So these are the people I'm going to be talking about in what I call long-term researchers. So if you go back to Sisyphus, so there are actually quite a lot of similarities, different angles from that. So first, Sisyphus was a king, I can't remember of where, but he was condemned for eternity by Hades, the god of the underworld, to roll a boulder up a hill or a mountain, only to see, as soon as he was at the top of the mountain, only to see the boulder roll down again, and he had to start all over again. And this concept, this idea of starting all over again, is something that is very familiar with long-term researchers, because when you're on short-term contract, and when we're talking short-term, really it's as short as, a few months, 3-6 months. If you're lucky, you'll have 5 years, but in general, it's usually, around 2 years. But, you can have 1 3-year contract. And obviously, once you get to the end of your contract, you have to apply for a new job. Mm-hmm. And for some people, they will with the same principal investigator, the PI, they'll be with the same line manager for, a long time. But for many, they have to apply for a new job. Sometimes they have to change university, city, country more rarely, because usually, those long-term researchers are older than the early career researchers, so they'll have a family, so they'll try to stay in the same area. You change research group, you change line manager, so you will feel like you are starting all over again, effectively, and often you are, and in terms of grade as well, you are kind of starting from scratch. There's another reason as well. So there are 4 reasons why Sisyphus is quite important there. So the second one is like Sisyphus is a myth, and there are different definitions to what a myth is. So, the myth of Sisyphus is a traditional story in Greek mythology. And then another definition of myth is a widely held but false belief. And I think around long-term researchers, there are a lot of widely held but false beliefs. So I have heard over the years, I myself, I'm a long-term researcher, and I've heard over the years, many people talking about those researchers in derogatory terms. For example, the hanger-on, the passive postdoc, and, kind of the floater, which is one of my...
perhaps a homogenous group when actually everybody is an individual. So you can make assumptions that aren't correct for everybody.
Yeah, completely. That's a very good point. And I think there's this belief, as you say, there's one group and they hang on to their successful PI, you get a lot of funding. And as you say, it's a heterogeneous group. And even the ones who do stay with the same line manager, usually, they're there for a reason. They provide continuity, they supervise students or more junior postdocs. So they have a use for their line manager. Another reason why Sisyphus is useful as well to use is because, as you said yourself, you're not too familiar with the myth of Sisyphus. And I think, again, it's going back to what I was just saying. I think most people are not very familiar with who the long-term researchers are. When I started this research with Sarah Shinton, also at the University of Edinburgh, there was no study we knew that looked at, long-term researchers. There wasn't even a word to describe them. So that's another similarity. And finally, you'll be happy to.
Yes, cool. Finally.
Finally, Albert Camus. As we said, as I said, I'm originally French, and Albert Camus wrote a book called The Myth of Sisyphus, in which he discusses the meaning or the meaninglessness of life, which is far broader than the topic of the podcast, but where he basically concludes that we must imagine Sisyphus being happy, doing something that many other people would find absurd. And again, it's the same for long-term researchers. Often they are told, maybe you should change career. There's nothing for you there. You've been stuck in this career with no progression for 20 years. And this isn't how they see themselves. For a lot of them, they're in that research path because they love what they're doing and they're good at what they're doing as well. And I think, again, it's very important not to imagine what they are, but rather to ask them, why are you there? How did you get there? So that's it for Sisyphus.
Yeah, and no, I mean, it's really interesting to hear that, because there's so many important points in that in terms of the metaphor, and it really does, ring through this with what I've heard in my experiences. But what I was particularly interested in speaking to you for the podcast is what you've mentioned already, the research aspect, because we can easily make assumptions about people in general. So about the research itself, so what did you actually do? What was the research project? Who did you speak to?
So the research project, it was just, so initially, the research project was about the redeployment register at the University of Edinburgh, which is a way which we thought would be to reduce precarity amongst research staff, because if they're more likely to be redeployed, they're, obviously they won't be unemployed, which is the idea. But actually, when we were looking at that, I was thinking, well, actually, even though they're redeployed, they're still in precarious position. It's still short term. And obviously, people who are redeployed quite a lot or have been redeployed end up being often long-term researchers. If you're looking at the research staff side of things, obviously in professional services, there are similarities and parallels. And so what we did is kind of decided, we don't really know much about this population. As I said, there are a lot of assumptions. And we just decided, why don't we actually talk to long-term researchers? And so I sent a call at the university, asking long-term research staff to get back to me. I would interview them for about an hour, and 25 people got back to me, and that's how it was. Everything comes from those 25 interviews, and I was hoping for 20. We don't actually know how many long-term research staff there are, and again, this is something.
Yeah.
The whole sector, we don't know. We think. I saw in one paper, it was an OECD, no, it was a Vitae paper, that said about 1/3 of researchers had been on temporary contracts for more than 10 years. Yeah. So, we think maybe 1/3 in research universities, but we don't really know. So I was hoping 20 people would get back to me. 25 people did. And the results from this research come from those interviews.
So what would you see as the key findings in the investigation, and perhaps what might have surprised you? So what were generally the key findings? But say, was there anything surprising?
Well, when you start from nothing, everything is almost surprising. So yes. that was very exciting. And I think what was surprising to many of the participants is that they weren't the only ones. So most people think that they are the only ones in that situation to have been, long-term researchers. Everybody else they know seems to be early career. But the key findings was pretty much what you touched on earlier, that there are, it's not a homogeneous group. And I kind of separated the group into 3 identities. So the first identity is what I called the candidates. And it's basically a long-term researcher who see themselves in a kind of transitional role. And they have been postdocs sometimes, they still call themselves early career researchers. And what they want to do is secure a lectureship. They want to have a permanent position. They want to teach. They want to have their own research group. And effectively, what they dedicate their time to do is to tick all the boxes to become a researcher. So, they want to publish in high impact journals, they're applying for funding, they're teaching, they're getting all this experience. Interestingly, they were the most likely to say that if they did not secure a lectureship soon, they would leave academia altogether. So they were the first identity. The second one are the ones I called the accidental researchers. And so it's a word I'm still a bit uncomfortable with, but having spoken to the participants, no one took offense. They kind of understood what I meant. An accident, you have happy accidents and unhappy accidents. So there it's a bit the same. So you have the happy accidental researcher, who is usually a researcher who didn't necessarily at the start of their career know where they wanted to go. They liked research, so they wanted to stay there for a bit, and they ended up with usually a line manager who's quite good at securing funding, and they stayed with them, and that line manager has acknowledged that actually the long-term researcher is very important, so they kept them. So it's really organic, it's working for everybody. The second unhappy accidental researcher, there are a lot of stories of discriminations and flaws as well in the current research culture system in a way. So you have a lot of people who describe themselves as interdisciplinary. And, when you apply for lectureships, so often it's very discipline specific.
Yes.
And they have often never felt that they could apply for lectureships and for fellowships as well. A lot of them said, well, I sent some applications, and because it's interdisciplinary, I'll have one reviewer getting it or part of it. The other reviewer will get the different part, and then it doesn't quite work. They never seem to have some feedback where everybody gets it. So there's a large percentage of long-term researchers who are interdisciplinary researchers. And then there's a huge percentage as well of researchers who are women who often went part-time either after having children or because of caring responsibilities. And because they end up being part-time, often they can't attend, the same number of meetings. They can't produce the same number of papers as someone who is full-time. And although we're supposed to be judged in terms of, full-time equivalence, this isn't how it works. So they're the kind of what I called the unhappy accident, because their career, basically their personal circumstances really affected their professional life. And then the last identity, which I call the career researcher, are researchers who, they may have started as candidates, they're not mutually exclusive. Many of the people I interviewed really had different identities in different times of their career. And they may have started as accidental, as candidates, and there are people who took the conscious decision to remain in a research only career, despite the precarity of the position. Yes. And they would describe themselves as career, usually very happy with what they're doing, and all they're saying is, well, we would like a different academic structure that allows us to be who we are, to do what we do. Because even though they're on research-only contract, they do far more than research. As I said earlier, they support often the line manager, they teach, they do lots of things that are not really accounted for in their contracts, but they know that's where they want to be.
Yeah, it's interesting to listen to you in connection to the other podcasts in this series, because there's another theme, a number of themes that are coming through, and particularly disadvantage towards women. As a whole podcast from colleagues from Sweden on the title is about women screwed from the start, is the beginning of the title of the presentation. So yes. The connections are there. So in terms of the findings, it's nice to hear the clarity, and I've not really heard the categorizations before that you've put forward there. So does this lead to recommendations then in terms of research? Other things, because a lot of the precarity of short-term contracts, long-term researchers, this has been ongoing for, I've been in research for, I've got to admit it, decades now. So are there recommendations that we could have coming out of this research to address some of these research cultural points, which we keep coming back to?
Yes, the name of the conference was How Do We Stop Losing Talent in Research Careers? Yes. And definitely, so the recommendation, what really struck me when I was speaking to the long-term researchers is how the current academic structure is ill-adapted to contemporary research. We're expecting this kind of PhD, postdoc, lecturer career path. And actually, a tiny proportion of people do go to that. I can't remember what was that famous Royal Society graph that said, was it about 3% of...
It is a small amount, definitely, yes.
And if there was no space in academia for these long-term researchers, then they wouldn't be employed. No one is employing people just because they like them. There needs to be, they're there. And what is amazing is if you actually, so in terms of recommendation, the recommendation is really broaden up the academic career structure. Not forget, but don't just have PhD, postdoc, lecturer. The reason for that is because research has changed from the time, this kind of structure was established decades and decades ago. So, you have more and more huge team science. Some papers before, if you think maybe 50, 60 years ago, you had one author on a paper. Now they have, what do they call this, mega authorship paper.
Yes.
Because it's acknowledged that most research, certainly in STEM, it's a bit different in the humanities, but in STEM, you're doing it with a team. So first of all, it would be acknowledging the fact that it's with a team. And also, if you think of the current structure, you effectively have from lecturers to professors at the top. Then there's a huge gap where they are expected only to line manage junior staff. And by junior staff, I mean, PhD students and early career researchers. And effectively, the reason why, professors, lecturers are employing long-term researchers is because they know they have more experience. They should need less management, certainly in terms of the research. I mean, everybody needs, keeps on needing training and management. You can't just leave people alone. But they also provide continuity. And I think in terms of, it doesn't make sense to think, really, if you think of whether it's at university or in any other company, you don't just have the big boss and then the junior staff. You need someone in the middle. And the long-term research staff, I think, are providing this someone in the middle. And then finally, as I said about the interdisciplinary researchers, we talk about them a lot. We say interdisciplinary is fantastic, but actually often what it means, it's interdisciplinary projects, not interdisciplinary people. And again, this career, the current career structure doesn't allow for that. When there's a lectureship is advertised, it's very, very specific. And same for, as I said earlier, the fellowships. So it doesn't work anymore. It doesn't really account for the diversity of the workforce in academia. And if you open up the career structure, I think that the problem of diversity that the higher education or some sectors of the higher education has will open up simply because you are opening up this kind of the career structure. Different people will fill different spaces. And I think it will be organic rather than forcing certain things so much. So just diversify the career structure, you'll diversify your workforce. So these are the recommendations, really. No,
that's excellent. There's so many, just listening to you, there's so many interesting points that come out from this and the work and the discussion. I could ask 1,000 questions. We could go on at length, but I was trying to, if I could just bring things to a close. So the recommendations you mentioned there was terrific. It is a research project. Will there be publications? Can the listener get a hold of some more information on this? Yes, so there is already a publication. It's been published in September 2022, and it's in PLOS ONE. And it's the two co-authors are myself and Sarah Shinton, and maybe we can, I don't know if we can put a link on. We will put it into the show notes. Yes. Of the podcast. That'll be terrific. Yes. That just leads me to I feel like I've cut the conversation short a little bit because there was so many points to discuss. But thank you for joining us. It was really good to listen to you. Thank you. Thank you. I mean, if you want, I can also say there's a follow-up to that. We've also done, because it was a one institution study, we thought it's important to know that our results aren't biased towards one institution. So we sent out a survey in July, and it's fantastic. We got 185 responses over 20 institutions in the UK. So there will be more. That sounds, well, it's even better, a more robust study as well, the more data and the more information. So that's something to look out for. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Tony.
Thanks for listening to the Research Culture Uncovered podcast. Please subscribe so you never miss out on our brand new episodes. And if you're enjoying the discussions, give us some love by dropping a 5-star rating and written review, as it helps other research culturists find us. And please share with a friend and show them how to subscribe. Email us at academicdev@leeds.ac.uk. Thanks for listening, and here's to you and your research culture.